Hello and welcome to the Drexel InterView. I'm your host, Paula Marantz Cohen, speaking to you from the Drexel University Picture Gallery. Today our guest is the author, critic, and journalist Christopher Hitchens. Mr. Hitchens is a contributing editor to Vanity Fair and a visiting professor of liberal studies at the New School in New York City. He is here to discuss his latest book, Hitch 22, a memoir. This is a two-part interview. In the first part, we'll be dealing with the more personal aspects of the memoir, and in the second part, the more political aspects, though of course there's bound to be overlap between personal and political. Christopher Hitchens, welcome to the Drexel InterView.
Thanks for having me.
I say Christopher.
Yes, please.
Because I know that you prefer to be called Christopher and not Chris, and you mention in your memoir the fact that early in your career at Oxford, the Marxists with whom you were involved called you Chris, and the tutors and the more elite faculty at Oxford called you Christopher. And I wonder if your preference doesn't suggest an underlying political loyalty from the very beginning.
The loyalty, alas, is less complicated than that. It was to my mother and to her social aspirations. She called me Christopher because she thought it was a nice name. She thought to shorten it to Chris, to circumcise it or amputate it, was a crime. And especially since my second name begins with H, and in England everything depends on the aspirate, and people who drop them are crude. The next thing that happens if you are called Chris and your name is Hitchens is Chris Hitchens. And that she would have thought would be unforgivably lower class.
Your upbringing was middle class, lower middle class, would you say? I don't know if those gradations...
Well, no one in England puts themselves in the lower middle class. They always want to say lower or maybe upper middle, or just middle. My father's family was quite working class. They came from a tough district in the Portsmouth dockyards where my grandfather rose to be a school teacher in a rather hard school. My father got out of it by moving into the Navy, going off to sea. He wouldn't have sounded like me at all. They wouldn't have spoken like this. And my mother's family came from a Jewish background in Liverpool. Again, by no means the forcing house of the British bourgeoisie. And both of them had sort of social aspirations, my mother particularly. And these were projected, is the word, I suppose, onto your humble servant because I was the firstborn, and the proof that you've moved into the middle class proper in England is very simple. At least the firstborn son has to go to a private school.
Okay.
And then to a university.
Okay,
and which none of my family had done before. So I was always very acutely aware of the tiniest social nuances. George Orwell says about the English that they're all branded on the tongue from the moment they're born. It still is amazingly true.
So the accent.
The accent and the avoidance of certain commonplace expressions as well.
Interesting.
And above all, holding on to the H's.
So do you think that this class, this weight of class on you was part of the reason why you felt liberated and became an American citizen? I guess this happened after 9/11, but nonetheless, do you think you were drawn in that direction?
Well, I can't explain completely why it was that in my teens I began to have this very strong need to come to the United States. But there it was. It was as strong as my need to become a writer. It wasn't a desire, it was a compulsion. In fact, I now realize they were probably two aspects of the same thing. But no question about it, yes, it was a means of getting out of a society that was rather too stratified, with oneself not stratified perhaps quite high up enough on the ladder. And
yet you managed to rise pretty high. I want to talk about your parents. First, your father. You already mentioned the fact that he came from a working class background, but he himself was in the British Navy. You refer to him affectionately and somewhat satirically as the commander. He seems to be a certain sort of British type that you admire and that I feel you feel is a lost breed.
And from a lost empire, too, which was dying, visibly dying while I was growing up. I was being educated in schools that admired and almost were still training you to work for an empire that when you opened the newspaper or turned on the TV, you could see was winding down. Weird feeling. And my father, who'd been all around the world on the deck of a Royal Navy warship, policing this empire, and then had a very tough time in the Second World War, very, very grueling Second World War, was let go by the Navy shortly after the war, and felt that everything he'd worked for and everything he'd given his life to had proved not worthwhile, really, and that he wouldn't have put it like this, but I did. He'd been rather taken for granted and rather exploited by the establishment, the monarchy, the empire, to which he'd been so loyal. And that had a big influence in moving me to the left, because I thought, you do all this, you do everything right, you're brave, you're thrifty, you're flinty, you work, as they say here, work hard and play by the rules, and they don't treat you right.
Your mother then, and I feel there the emotion is very intense. Yvonne, a name that, as you note, is not an English name in itself, says something, was a glamorous character, an artistic character in certain respects, a dramatic character. She died in a suicide pact with her lover, who was a manic depressive, a former minister, and you, this was when you were already grown, you were an adult. This must have been devastating for you, and I wonder how it changed your view of the world or of people when this happened.
Well, the whole axis of the idea of my divided self, which is in a way the point of the book, is the huge contrast between her and my father. Among other things, he was 12 years older than her. And very stoic and continent, as I said, in a man of few words, but very honest and decent, but frankly boring, or boring for her. She was bored by him, I could tell. And she would have liked a world of sort of brittle cocktail parties and gay visits to the theatre and so forth. And she never got that, as a naval officer's wife, being moved around one grim base to another. And she tried in the millinery business, which was what her mother had been in also, to do something for the world of fashion, but it never worked out. She didn't have a very good business head, actually. So I grew up feeling in a different way sorry for both of them. And in those days, people of that class didn't get divorced. I used to wonder why they didn't, but I knew why. You just don't. It would be a scandal. And as a result, she waited too long. She waited till my brother and I had left home. When she finally broke it to me and introduced me to the guy who she desperately wanted me to approve of, I remember saying to myself, I can stand anything as long as she doesn't say, I waited till you and Peter were old enough. And then she did say exactly that. And I thought, what a waste, you know?
Well,
and she'd left it too late. And she was beginning to lose her looks, and she was very beautiful. I think felt it very acutely.
So she chose the wrong person.
And she chose, instead of a stoic but dull and honest and hardworking and reliable commander, Hitchens, she picked a spoiled priest of the Church of England, a guy who could quote the odd poem, who probably did like going to the theatre and cocktail parties, things like that.
Sounds Madame Bovary-ish.
Couldn't hold a job, was what we now would call a flake. And I now realize bipolar as well. And she didn't need to die or want to die, but she wanted someone who did need to die. And I believe he talked her into a pact of suicide when they realized it wasn't going to work out and they weren't going to get another chance with anyone else. So it was.
But you can never know the details behind it.
I can't know all of it, no, but I've done a lot of thinking about it, and I'm fairly sure that's what it was.
Well, you do mention that your mother, you found out after her death that she was Jewish.
Yes.
That was her background. And I think this is, it's interesting you say she was in no sense a Jewish mother, stereotypically, and yet the idea that she wanted to sacrifice, well, she hid her Judaism so that you and your brother could get on, strikes me as the epitome of the self-sacrificing Jewish mother taken to an extreme. Have you thought of that? Yeah,
self-sacrificing is one thing, but the classic martyred Jewish mother is not so self-effacing about her Jewishness, usually. I think my mother genuinely wanted to pass for her own sake. For one thing, she didn't, as they say, look Jewish. She looked French to me when I was a kid. My father never knew. See, his family would have minded.
Yes, you write that in the book.
I'm sorry to say, my grandfather would certainly not have wanted a Jewish daughter-in-law.
Well, may I ask you something?
Yes.
I interrupt you. Do you think growing up knowing you were Jewish would have changed you in some essential way?
Well, my only answer possible answer, thinkable answer to that is I can't believe it wouldn't have.
Because it would have been a major issue.
You know,
with,
so that boys like Mr. Kissen and Mr. Wertheimer wouldn't have seemed exotic to me. And I thought, actually, no, we're brothers under the skin. Funny thing is, I did an event with my friend Martin Amis at the Jewish Book Fair in London a couple of years ago. And I was doing a book signing afterwards, and I realized I should look up. There was something happening. And there were 3 or 4 of the young guys I'd been at Oxford with, all the Jews who'd been there, at a time when I hadn't known and they hadn't known. And we'd all found out since, and they knew that I knew, and so forth. And they'd all come, and there they were. And of course I looked at them in a completely different way. You know, we could have been cracking kind of odd jokes together and doing this and that.
Yeah, you would have had a different social scene, let's put it that
yes,
way.
I'm certain I would, yeah.
Okay.
But actually, if you join, as I did, the extreme Trotskyist Marxist left, you find that you practically are in a minyan.
You did your work at Oxford in literature? Was that your
No, I
area?
should have done.
Because you're steeped in literature and you refer to literary works throughout your book, and I'm struck by certain characters of books that you mention. Well, Orwell certainly, and Waugh. And it strikes me that you identify with Charles Ryder in Brideshead Revisited. Daniel Deronda is mentioned at one point. You studied that book with Edward Said, the Palestinian scholar.
Yes.
People who don't know Daniel Deronda is George Eliot's great book in which the character discovers he's an English aristocrat, or thinks he is. It discovers he's Jewish midway through. Fascinating, wonderful book.
Great book.
It strikes me also that there's sort of aspects of Johnsonian, Samuel Johnson friendship in your book. There's a sense of the Cambridge spies. There's a sense in which you've modeled yourself, or perhaps, I don't know whether it's unconsciously, used literary references to present yourself. Are you aware of this?
Yes.
Maybe even Pip in Great Expectations. There's a bit of that there as well.
Well, I hope it isn't. I hope it doesn't seem in any sense feigned, but yes, I mean, as soon as I realized that I thought there was no moral or ethical content to religion, which I discovered quite early, I went looking for ethical discussions and confrontations about ideas and principles in literature, and to some extent in history. And Orwell was very important because he wrote his social novels, I'm talking about, not the anti-totalitarian ones or the essays, but his novels like Coming Up for Air, Keep the Aspidistra Flying, Clergyman's Daughter. They're not very easy to find, but they're really worth digging out. And I didn't know novels were written about families like ours. I didn't think, you mean we can be literary too? It was like Molière's Monsieur Jourdain, who says, I didn't realize he's been speaking prose all his life. Evelyn Waugh, well, who can't be moved by just the comic genius of that? And also the tragic element of it.
The character of Charles Ryder, there are interesting points of correspondence.
Well, no one who's been young and at Oxford doesn't have some point of view about Brideshead Revisited. And I call it Brideshead Regurgitated in the book, because there's always the terrible danger of an attempt to revive it, which would undoubtedly be hammy, but privately, everyone thinks, well, this person is the Sebastian Flyte of our time. I can actually remember who we used to think was the Sebastian Flyte character.
And were you assigned the role?
Amazing chap called, and also the Anthony Blanche character. No, I wasn't. I was by then in a very austere leftist milieu where we would have thought that was unpardonably frivolous. We're not going to be doing Brideshead when Vietnam is burning from end to end.
You were still having your dinners with James Sparrow.
Off the record. I was.
Yeah.
By night, I would don another garb, but no, we wouldn't have gone around giving punting parties with peaches and champagne and so forth.
It would have been a little too
Yes,
self-indulgent.
we were supposed to be giving out leaflets in favor of Dr. King and against the Vietnam War and for the students in solidarity with the students in France and things like that.
But you were always split, weren't you, between this sense of austerity, political austerity, you know, leftist solidarity, and this more luxurious, more effete way of looking at the world.
Well, you put it very well, but remember for me, my life experience had been that the affectation of austerity was a thing of the right wing, of the very sort of almost Calvinist, military, civil service, middle class that I was from, where
Interesting.
frugality was, an ethos. I mean, I identified it with a very conservative worldview. For me, pushing the boat out a bit with perhaps the odd peaches and cream and
So
brandy
that's
and
how you were
champagne
able
was
to
was really more like moving to the left.
So you could reconcile the peaches and
Don't you
cream
think that's
with
ingenious, by the way?
That is so ingenious. Now, you got out of that
I
one
think
beautifully.
Oscar himself could have.
Yeah.
Well, actually, Wilde did used to say things like that because he was actually a very serious socialist, but he certainly had champagne tastes. And I think he used to say, languidly sipping from a flute, nothing's too good for the working class. That sort of thing.
Yes. One of the hallmarks of your writing style is a quality of being emphatic. You are a bad boy of journalism, as they say. You are an agent provocateur. And yet, I found one of the most interesting and not quite as lucid as your usual writing in your book was the chapter about changing one's mind.
Yes.
I found that a very fascinating and not Hitchens-like chapter or portion of a chapter, where you talk about how mind changing happens gradually. And it seemed to me that you were really speaking about the need or the possibility in you for ambiguity or tentativeness or uncertainty. And I wonder if, I felt this was very genuine, what you were writing there, but I wonder if you ever feel that this philosophy and your style are at odds with each other.
A little bit, yes. And thank you, by the way, for noticing that, because it's very important to me. I also argue that it's not always a question of your changing your mind. I think very often your mind changes you. You suddenly realize that without having intended to think something, or while intending to think something, you can't quite do it anymore. It doesn't mean the same to you as it used to.
Yeah.
And you wonder why. And if you want to take an honest exploration of why that is, it may lead you in some alarming but fruitful directions. That's actually why I called the book Hitch 22, because it's a minor key echo of the great Joe Heller's paradox, but in a lifetime that's had quite a lot of commitment in it and allegiance. I've now reached a point where I'm mainly associated with a group of people who I suppose could be described as adamant for skepticism, or resolved for uncertainty, or certain only of the principle of uncertainty, so to say. And you know who I'm talking about, Richard Dawkins and others with whom I'm very, very flatteringly associated. Long may this overpraise continue. And this pits us, of course, against. It's not as soft a position as it might look. It pits us against the people who are completely sure they have all the answers, the modern totalitarians, the ones who have all the information they need, and who indeed have the truth because it's been revealed to them. They're already qualified to tell us what to do. Opposition to that lot is the cause of my life, and always has been in a way. And opposition to all forms of totalitarianism, not just as the system of thought, but in the mind.
But do you ever feel that you're expected to be extreme, and that sometimes you just would like to be not extreme? I mean, you see both sides, you perhaps see the other side, but you see this side, but that's really not your persona in the media.
I don't know about extreme. Of course, it's very hard for me to guess how I'm viewed, but I suppose probably not as a centrist, no. But that's different from being an extremist. Anyway, no, I know of myself that I never take a position for effect. I don't do that.
Well, I want to talk about your friendships. You know, this has been, I guess you've been asked this question too many times, about your male friendships, your friendship with Martin Amis, whom you seem to adore, the son of the great and inimitable Kingsley Amis, whom you also knew and liked, at least before the end of his life. And then James Fenton, the poet. Others, you mentioned you had a Friday, when you were in London, you used to have a Friday meeting of these people and sort of imitate the Algonquin Round Table.
No, not consciously.
Not consciously?
No.
I thought some of the limericks and some of the witticisms sounded to me a little bit as though you were very consciously involved in trying to do.
Look,
Dorothy Parker.
One can't be unaware of the existence of things like that. But where we were meeting was actually in Bloomsbury. So the thing we had to particularly pretend not to be emulating
I see.
was the Bloomsburys. And
So you were not
I really
emulating.
don't think we were much like them.
No, I don't think so either. I think there
Actually,
was
at the time, it didn't seem like a set at all. It does now. And it's been enshrined now in lots of books and memoirs, and it's become quasi-legendary. But then it really was a pretty much informal Friday lunch get-together that would often go on until it got dark.
And now you still have periodic meetings of some of those people in New York. Is that right?
Or London, or anywhere where we can meet.
Okay. Now, the point there, though, is that there are so few women in that circle. And, I guess...
None, to be exact.
None.
At that
And
lunch.
in academic parlance, we would call this an expression of homosocial bonding to the nth degree.
Sounds all right.
I wonder, what do you make of that? It's peculiar. As a woman looking at it, I
Yes.
would have liked to be part, but I realize I would have no role.
There was no prohibition. It wasn't an all-male club. Sometimes women, I remember Julie Kavanagh came. I think Tina Brown may have come a couple of times as well. But none of them really wanted to come regularly. Without anything being said, it was a male bonding
You think
event.
it was the kind of humor, the kind of talk that was involved, that was of a certain sort of...
No. If you mean the rude limericks and so
Yes.
forth. No, because women are very good at that, and also find it fantastically funny.
Not
and
the
also,
women I
also
know.
very often men try much harder if there are women there.
That's
very
true.
often the real vice I find of closed male clubs and similar societies is that they're almost certain to degenerate into tedium, because without the spur of womanhood, a lot of people don't perform very well.
So how come this did work without women?
Whereas in the evenings, say, I mean, there was Julian. If we all met at Kingsley's house, there would be girls. Tammers and Day-Lewis, I remember.
Do you think
the sister of?
Are there
and,
ways in which
Pat,
women?
Pat Kavanagh, the great literary agent, who was.
But as you said yourself,
Mrs. Julian Barnes.
they were not usually there, and they were sort of on the periphery.
Not
so,
at this squalid kebab house. No,
So
they weren't.
what is the appeal? What is the nature of this all-male camaraderie? I mean, that it wasn't just happenstance.
It was not much more than that. Again, if we'd sat down and said this is a boys' lunch, no, that would have been something something doomed about that. I feel it just happened to be that way.
You don't think
And
there's...
there are forms of friendship that can only occur between men.
Okay, well, that's the question.
Yeah.
What is that? Can you explain a little more?
If I ask myself, say, with Martin, who's my most adored friend, every man should have somebody who knows his whole story. I mean, without being told, or having to be told next time they meet. I mean, he knows your backstory. He's been through it all with you, hashed it over the next day, perhaps, been there when it was whatever it was happening. Don't need to speak of it. You know, it's just a whole layer there. You can't. It's very hard to have that kind of platonic, shall we say, friendship with a female. It just is. I think I have the impression that for women that's more or less the same. That their confidants don't tend to be men.
Well, I'll have to think about that. But I think it's different.
Or
Yeah.
not always. This wouldn't always work either. Or not heterosexual men.
Okay.
A lot of women have gay male confidants.
Okay.
A lot of my female friends do that. But it would tend to be another girl who knew all your innermost.
Okay. Now, the distinction you draw between the, heterosexual and the homosexual, you do describe in your book a number of homosexual experiences that you've had throughout your life, and yet you hold strongly to the line that you are heterosexual. And I wonder about that, why you feel the need to have that category even.
No, I hold strongly to the line, which is really my reason for putting it in the book. Because I did wonder whether I wanted to or should. No, the whole is to point out that in almost every heterosexual man I've ever met, there's quite a lot of the gay. And I thought it might be worth saying this and reminding people of it at a time when homosexuality is still being attacked as an illness or a crime or a disorder. That if more heterosexual men would admit that they knew more about it than they let on.
Okay. You have a very moving section at the end of your book about your children. And you speak, it's as much regret, I think, as expression of love in terms of what perhaps you hadn't done or
Yes.
might have done as a father. What kind of reaction did they have to that? I found it one of the most moving sections of the book.
I don't know, and I wonder if I'll ever find out.
Have you asked them?
No, certainly not.
Why not?
Well, it would be too much of a leading question. Hey, have you got to the bit about you yet? I wouldn't do that. I made sure they all saw it early on, but I haven't had any feedback. Actually, my children don't tend to read my stuff.
Oh, mine don't either. But that's the reason why you ought to discuss it with them, so they don't miss it.
It's there for them to come across one day. I don't need them to read it now, but I wanted to get it down. They might read it after I'm gone.
That's true. Anyway, we're out of time for this section,
Oh, don't say.
unfortunately. But we'll be back, and I want to thank you, Christopher Hitchens, for this interview.
Thank you so far.
And thank you for joining us today at the Drexel interview. Hello and welcome to the Drexel interview. I'm your host, Paula Marantz Cohen, speaking to you from the Drexel University Picture Gallery. This is the second part of a two-part interview with author and journalist Christopher Hitchens. Mr. Hitchens is a contributing editor to Vanity Fair and a visiting professor of liberal studies at the New School in New York City. We are talking about his latest book, Hitch 22, a memoir. In the first part of our interview, we discussed the more personal aspects of his life as recorded in his book. In this part, we'll discuss the more political aspects, though as I've noted, it may be hard to keep these two separate. Christopher Hitchens, welcome back to the Drexel interview.
It's nice to be back.
You note that when you were at Oxford, your friend James Fenton said that you were the second most famous individual at Oxford at the time.
Strangely wounding remark.
You
yes.
were annoyed by this, of course, but it seems to me somewhat complimentary. What were you second famous for?
Second famous for? Oh, it would have been rushing onto the pitch to disrupt a South African team at a cricket match, for example.
Okay.
Or shutting down a debate, which I'm now rather embarrassed at having done at the Oxford Union, our world-famous debating society, because of the Foreign Secretary's arrival to defend the invasion of Cambodia. Things like that was what I was well known.
These were high-profile
That
political...
and, of course, sexual charisma and brideshead regurgitated and stuff.
That too. Those two aspects, yeah.
Yeah, you would have had a reasonable chance of knowing who I was, I think, yes.
Well, that's quite something to be have such a high profile. Now, did you work at that?
Yes, but it's a terrible thing because one had learned at school that the boys who were good at everything and became head boy and so forth were famous. The ones you're never going to hear from again.
Yeah, but once you're at Oxford, it may be
Flash
different.
in the pan, possibly.
Yeah. You are, and you say you were, a product of the 1960s, very much so, and particularly the events of 1968. Do you still think of yourself as of that time as a 68er, as you say at one point?
Well, I think I prefer that to being thought of as just a 60s person. I mean, the 60s person is someone like Bill Clinton, who was at Oxford with me, in point of fact, just another greedy narcissist who thinks that you qualify by a lot of sex and dope, essentially. I mean, I thought...
That's what you thought? Did you think
And by that, all you have to do to qualify there is to have been born in a certain year. Might as well call yourself a boomer and have done with it. 68 means someone who took part, mentally as well as physically, in what was the last gasp, as I now realize it was, of the socialist revolutionary movement in Western Europe, and Eastern Europe too, and of course elsewhere. And for whom battles over the writings of Rosa Luxemburg, Leon Trotsky, C.L.R. James, Victor Serge, and so on, George Orwell, were real things and unbelievably tangible, meant much more to us than the studies we were supposed to be undertaking. Yes, I would own to that. I'd own up to that, and I'd say that some of what it taught me, and certainly how to conduct an argument dialectically, was worth having and stays with me.
So even if the ideas have changed, the form is still there.
Yes, and then one more thing, I suppose, not to sound, because I know that my students find nothing more boring than reminiscences of old 60s radicals, and I can understand why, since we've left them not much except political correctness and safe sex, two kind of parodic malformations of the thing. But to have had the experience of really thinking, waking up in the morning and thinking, there is a world revolutionary uprising going on. You can see it on the faces of the college establishment and on the faces of the political establishment and the policemen. They don't know what's gone wrong. They've lost their sense that they're in charge. Every piece of news was more revolutionary and amazing than the last. American cities burst into flames because it's enough already with the treatment of black America. Assassinations of leading politicians. Unbelievable, unconquerable resistance of the Vietnamese people. Next, you wake to find that Charles de Gaulle has had to flee Paris in a helicopter to go and talk to his generals because he doesn't control Paris anymore.
It was
Paris
exciting.
Paris is in the hands of the Parisians.
The sense of possibility.
And then the extraordinary developments in Czechoslovakia, which portend, on this we were absolutely right, by the way, portend for a sure thing the end of the Russian Empire in Europe anyway, and of the Cold War. So this was, you really felt you were playing a part in history, and obviously little of that was being too young and too cocky. But it wasn't completely bogus, and I'm sort of sorry for someone who's never had a moment like that. It doesn't come along every generation.
Well, I want to then, you did mention Bill Clinton, and you
Yes.
just make a distinction between your own activism, your own form of 60s involvement and his, and you do seem to have you do have an abiding disdain, if not hatred, for him. Did this begin? Contempt. Different then from your feeling about Henry Kissinger. That's hatred and the other's contempt, or are they on the same level?
Well, I've got room to, plenty of both, actually.
For both?
For Mr. Kissinger, plenty of both. For Clinton, hatred would be sort of wasted on him. He's a contemptible figure, I think.
And did you feel that going way back to the time when you knew him?
No, I hardly knew him. And he would have been a little bit older than me anyway. He is older than me, and he came as a Rhodes Scholar. He'd already been to university. I was an undergraduate. But I did know, and I write about the wonderful American Rhodes Scholars who were there with me, and the great courage and thoughtfulness they showed, because they were supposed to be having the time of their lives, being representatives of their country and their state in Oxford, and that was the whole tradition, and there they were representing a country that they thought was fighting an illegal and immoral war and double-dealing its responsibilities on civil rights. So they would, when we would come out, I actually put this, I think, into the mouth of James Fenton, who pointed it out to me. When we'd come out of the dining hall at the end of dinner and onto the grass and have a smoke and a cocktail and a chat and a flirt and so forth, there would be a circle of Americans under the elm tree just at one side. And we all knew they had a much more serious conversation they had to have, which effectively was this: am I going to go to jail? Am I going to go to Sweden or Canada? Or am I going to go to Vietnam?
Yeah.
At that age, and people would say that all they were afraid of was being drafted. That's an absolutely disgusting lie. I remember how brave they were and how principled they were, except for Clinton, who we know now was a shameless egomaniac draft dodger who managed to discredit the anti-war movement by his lying. That, in case you wondered, of the many things I can't stand him for, it's because of people like him, shabby characters like him, that the moral credit of the anti-war movement was diminished in so many people's minds.
Now, your view of Clinton and the fact that you testified against him.
Offered to do so, yeah.
You offered it. It was not, didn't happen. But
No.
yeah, but this was the beginning of your receiving certain sorts of responses from the left or from friends, so-called friends, who felt that you were a turncoat that then accelerated.
Yes, yeah.
Would you say that was the first point where you really
Yes.
deviated from the expected line?
Yeah.
And how
Sorry,
did you...
that's a rather casual reply. Yes, I think, I dare say you're right. And
How did that feel? And did you realize there would be more of it, and that this was something that at first was just difficult to take?
well, there's something I've known ever since I was on the left in the first place, and on the ideological hard left, and that which is that and what actually everybody knows in some part of their being, but I knew from experience, you can't be just a little bit heretical. If you start reconsidering your relationship with, shall we say, the liberal wing of the Democratic Party, you'll find more and more things coming to your attention. You can't disagree with them on just one thing. And since they'd all decided that rallying to the defense of this oaf and liar and bully was a matter of principle, I mean, it really seemed to matter to them that he be acquitted on charges where he was obviously guilty, be allowed to bully women witnesses and perjure himself. And, you know, this squalid, disbarred lawyer as he now is, was their cultural hero. I thought, well, this means I really am out of here.
Does it bother you, though, that when you make...
The book I wrote against him was published by a Marxist publishing house.
Okay.
It was the last thing I consciously did for the left, was to say, if the left thinks Clinton is kosher, then it's making a terrible mistake. But it turned out they did think he was kosher, so that meant a sort of logical conclusion for me. Well, then I'm not really in this galère anymore.
But what if, do you feel that as soon as you're not part of that galère, as you say, you become shunted to the other galère?
No, there's no need for that.
But I just noticed in the Times on Sunday, you're there at a group of neoconservative elite, as it was described in the caption. And I wondered how you feel about now being labeled as part of the neoconservative elite, almost by default.
This is a party given in Washington for someone. I try not to have heroes or heroines, and I always tell other people not to. Even when people say they're fans of mine, I say, don't be a fan. But I do regard Ayaan Hirsi Ali as personally heroic. I'm lost in admiration for her. And anyone who has a party in her honor or for her book, I'll go to that party, all right. That the left has abandoned her is the question surely here. That the left has, seeing the image and the reality, the personality of the most important public intellectual probably ever to come out of Africa, with an extraordinary experience, life experience to tell, and a warning to deliver about theocracy in all its forms, is considered to be somehow untouchable by the left. That's what the problem is. It's nothing to do with me.
Okay.
But it also, it seems to me, it's another proof of how culturally and politically reactionary the left has become.
And the media, of course, immediately labels you in the other camp.
Well, I'm so tired of that. I mean, I could go on if you like, but I mean...
No, don't.
Oh, that sort of thing just fatigues me, yeah.
You sort of ridicule the 60s dictum, the personal is political.
Yes.
But I wonder, reading your book, I'm struck by how the political for you is personal. And by that I mean that as soon as you have a personal involvement with somebody, it can very strongly affect, and I think this is normal, but I mean, you're particularly honest about it, it seems to me. It affects how you think, and the most dramatic example I can think of is your relationship with Mrs. Thatcher. And I am struck by how, having made a remark probably that was meant to be just provocative and satirical, that she was sexy, you wrote this. Her reaction to it, which was so game and so delightful, that I do think, and that you consciously or unconsciously became more drawn, if not to her politics, than to anything that she might support. I wonder if you could address that. Maybe you want to go over that little anecdote.
I think you may have just sold a few books in the last moment there. People will want to know what
let's not
was
tell
this,
them so that they buy the book.
What was this sexual encounter Christopher had with Margaret Thatcher? Maybe we shouldn't. It actually takes too long. But I did think she had a charisma that was not gender neutral. I mean, how could charisma be gender neutral, frankly? And I was ridiculed for saying so, but I don't think anyone would ridicule it now. I mean, all the evidence, the whole evidence is that I was completely right. She wasn't a shrill, narrow-minded suburban housewife at all. She was a woman of amazing character, and by the way, very beautiful skin and astonishing eyes once you got up close.
You really are
I'm surprised we held it to the little contact, the physical contact that we had. But above all, that she was a conviction person. This was at a time when the Labour Party, of which I was a rather shamefaced member, was in power in Britain and running a really, really mediocre, compromising, drifting regime. And there was a Tory leader, a woman at that, who really wanted to change the society and jerk everyone out of their torpor. And there were a lot of things I didn't agree with her about. I thought, well, we can't go on like this with a mediocre, corrupt Labour-Liberal alliance. And if change is going to come, if the left can't bring it off, then historically it means the right will take their chance. And then on one particular thing that I describe, I would have been on his side as a leftist anyway. Again, the left on the whole failed this test. But when the Argentine fascist dictatorship grabbed British islands in the South Atlantic, the Falklands, Malvinas, I'd been in Buenos Aires not long before, for quite a long time. It was a life-changing experience for me, and seen this death squad regime and interviewed its terrible Nazi leader and seen the pogroms it was mounting against the Jewish community in Argentina. It was absolutely amazing for me. And I thought, well, if Mrs. Thatcher wants to fight these people, I absolutely agree. And I hope we don't just kick them out of the Falklands, we kick them out of power altogether. I couldn't see how anyone with any decent claim to a radical conscience could think any other way.
But of course you had been in Argentina, as you say yourself, and you also
Yeah, but people knew. You didn't have to go to know.
But I wonder, I mean, again, with Iraq, you of course, again, truly annoyed the left by your support of the Iraq war.
Not all the left. And remember, it's the right wing that's opposed to the I mean, if you only count demonstrators, which is what a lot of people, I'm afraid, do, it looks different. But the opposition to the war in Iraq came from the American conservative political establishment, in particular the group around Henry Kissinger, Scowcroft, Eagleberger, flat out against. Then the Pat Buchanan-type isolationist right, very, very militantly against. Then Jacques Chirac, probably the most conservative politician in Western Europe at the time, and certainly the most corrupt. The Pope, almost every church, almost every religious organization.
But in the States, we think of Paul Wolfowitz and that group as being the neoconservative.
Well, that's the way people have to have it, because otherwise they'd have to think it out for themselves more. I don't mean to reproach you when I say that, but yes, if they absolutely cling to this model, but it doesn't hold up at any point. And it omits two things, both of which I know something about and I'll go on about in the book. One is the position of the Iraqi left, in particular the Iraqi trade union and socialist and communist movement, and the Kurds of the northeast, historically a very red and radical population leadership, all of whom were absolutely in favor of the overthrow of Saddam Hussein and worked with the United States and Britain to bring it about. And then a group of us, which I identify in the book one by one, I think quite an interesting little group of socialists and liberals for regime change in Washington. And we actually had what I think were some very good arguments. No one knows what they were because it's all drowned in this chorus of no blood for oil or whatever was the nonsense of the week. And so I've maybe at too great length, I've explained why it would be that someone of radical temper like myself or Peter Galbraith or Rolf Ekéus, the great Swedish socialist who ran the UN inspections, all came to the same conclusion. We can't any longer coexist with the Saddam Hussein regime.
So I guess what you are saying then that you're still a leftist. You've been able to save that for the left, and even your attack on Clinton.
Let's put it like this. I know how to argue with someone on the left as if to make them feel that their own principles are being challenged. Their own claim to being a socialist is under attack. Yeah, I know how to do that. What I wouldn't any longer do would be go around trying to persuade someone else to be a socialist, because I don't have the conviction for that anymore, I'm afraid. I don't think there really is a socialist movement or a socialist alternative any longer. While there was, I did my best for it. I still think like a Marxist quite a lot of the time. I mean, when I look at history or society, I'm using
the model.
Yes, sure.
But you don't call yourself a Marxist.
I would, if someone said, was I wouldn't say no. I wouldn't want to hear myself deny it.
Huh.
And you don't have to be a socialist to be a Marxist. I mean, Marxism is a supposedly objective theory of history and the laws of motion of political economy and so forth. It's actually quite persuasive. I mean, if you look at it as a Marxist at the recent developments in the American economy and the stock market and the nationalization of industry and the falling rate of profit and the fight between finance and industrial capital, it's amazing. I mean, this is exactly the kind of thing that he was always so good at analyzing.
Of course, with any model, it's often possible to find ways in which events can be made to fit the model.
True, but in the crisis of American capitalism of the last couple of years, a lot of people who hadn't thought about this before began to think, well, maybe this guy Marx was onto something. I mean, there are permanent features of capitalism that are pretty much irreconcilably in crisis. These can be bought off and postponed, but they are built into the system. And I think he was right to say so.
So perhaps I can call you a Marxist-influenced, non-ideological thinker. Is that to your liking?
Well, I suppose I would have to say non-ideological in that mainly one is opposed now to the totalitarian, the people who say they have an ideology that is the answer to everything. You know, I'm hostile.
Do you feel, as an atheist, and I now want to talk a little bit about your views, you are the author of the book God Is Not Great. You said in the book that it was one word too long.
Yes. No, there's my dear friend Salman Rushdie, about whom I also have a chapter, where, again, I like to think it's a great instance of friendship for its own sake, but also friendship as solidarity and a very important cause. Mm-hmm. No, he said, good title, but just one word too long.
No great there, in other words. Yeah. So do you feel, though, in your adamance against God, you're taking a kind of ideological view? You're so absolute there and so not open to other possibilities, or some might say that you're being a little bit rigid and dogmatic.
No, I think it's a settled conviction with me that there's no supernatural dimension and no divine authority. And why do I say it's so settled? Because it could be true, but the priests who claim they know it's true couldn't possibly know it. Right.
Yeah.
I'll grant that it could be true. I can't demonstrate that it isn't, but I can tell you that I don't know of any other primate or mammal who has better information than I, on the basis of which they can say, actually, it is true.
Yeah.
So I think that settles it pretty clearly right there.
Is this a subject on which you've gotten a great deal of hate mail?
No, very much to the contrary. I wouldn't have been surprised if I had some or a lot, and I continue to get. I've always had for this subject a bit. Sometimes, as when I was working with Salman when he was still undercover, sometimes very nasty stuff would be delivered to me that I had to take seriously. But usually it's just nasty. But no, overwhelmingly, I mean, I don't keep and print out my emails and my mail, and I rather distrust people who sort of use their post bag for reinforcement. But if I did, you'll have to trust me. You'd be amazed the number of people who wrote. So I feel so much better. I'm out of this now. I don't think I converted them, so to say. I'm sure in a lot of cases they already had doubts and reservations, and I've been invited by, I must say to their credit, a lot of Christian groups, largely Christian, some Jewish, to their colleges and institutions to debate their students. And I must say, I think that's very handsome.
You are, as you said, you write a lot, and you call it a compulsion. I wonder if you think of it, I mean, you are also known to drink. I don't know, and perhaps that's a compulsion too. Whether you feel that there is something pathological in the writing process, that you're seeking to fill perhaps an unfillable hole or gap in your being. Have you psychoanalyzed yourself in that regard at all?
George Orwell says that agreeing to write a book is like volunteering to contract a disease for a limited period of time. And then when you're cured, you go and contract it all over again. And I sometimes do. You get the premonitory pangs of thinking, I haven't started this book yet, but I must. But look, any profession has moments of that sort. They just, maybe they're in other professions, there are more people you can share it with. There's no one you can really turn to in mine. It's solitary. Yeah, it has to be.
But if I were to say, what else would you do rather than write?
There's nothing I could do. I mean, it was resolved for me first by the realization that it wasn't what I wanted to do, it was what I had to do. It was my vocation might sound pompous, but I know why that word exists.
Yeah.
And then there wasn't, to be frank, very much else I could do. I mean, I couldn't have been a lawyer. I certainly couldn't have been a doctor or anything like that.
Well, you could have been a lawyer. You're certainly good with words.
No, I can't picture it.
Well, I want to end by asking you about this Proust questionnaire that you have at the end of your book, which you say at Vanity Fair, you give this to people to get a sense of them. I'm not quite sure why it's called the Proust questionnaire.
Well, people think, I think, that it's a word, a set of questions put by Marcel Proust. In fact, it's not, and it doesn't occur anywhere in his à la recherche. It's it's a result of the fact that he liked to play these games, which were quite common in French young people's magazines when he was growing up. He liked filling out the answers, and we have 2 or 3 of his answers. And so Vanity Fair distills.
I see.
They're almost always the same question. What do you most dislike about your appearance? When and where were you most happy? What do you think is the lowest depth of misery? The best answer, by the way, given to what do you most dislike about your appearance question to Vanity Fair was by Salman Rushdie when he was still in hiding. And he said, what do I most dislike about my appearance? Its infrequency. That's the best answer
witty.
yet.
Yes. Well, you give the answer. I was struck by your answer to your most marked characteristic, and you said insecurity.
Yeah.
I don't think most people would necessarily see that, although perhaps after reading the book they'll think otherwise. Do you want to elaborate a little bit?
Well, it's part of the Hitch 22. If you consider yourself to be reasonably knowledgeable, say, and to a certain degree educated, what you will keep finding out is how little you know. If you're educated at all, you'll have to get more and more impressed by how uneducated you are. If you know anything about anything, the rate at which our ignorance is expanding, we know a lot more, but we know a lot more about a lot more and a lot less about a lot more that we're beginning to discover. So that's why one has to be a skeptic. That's why one has to avoid contamination with any ideology that is full of confidence and certainty and faith. So that's a death trap.
Well, thank you, Chris.
So it's important to be insecure.
I want to thank you very much for being with us today.
It's been a delight.
It's been fascinating.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you for joining us today at the Drexel Interview.